Anti-Semitism in the West is at all-time highs. Nobody would have dreamed that modern civilizations like Australia and Canada and other European cities would fall in the face of Islamic extremism after October 7th. Let's take a look at what actually is going on in Australia. It is of pandemic proportions. Listen to this report from Alex Rivkin of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. It's worse than you
Now in a
thought.
realm of domestic terrorism. For a long time, for the last 15 months, you and I and others have been talking about fracturing social cohesion amid weekly street protests, amid the university encampments, the things that the Greens were doing, the things the clerics were doing to incite hatred and violence against the community. All these things were fracturing the way communities dealt with each other and viewed each other. We're now well beyond that point. There is no social cohesion. We're now in a point of national security. And when you have a synagogue burned and the Prime Minister himself declaring it an act of terrorism, and a few days ago you had the attack on Alawa Synagogue, followed the next morning by an attack on Newtown Synagogue, which we've since learned wasn't merely another graffiti attack, it was another attempt to incinerate a synagogue, a place of worship in a heavily built up metropolitan area. We are dealing with domestic terrorism. And I think the government has to date failed to grasp the true gravity and severity of the moment. The need to convene national cabinet to say to the state premiers, we are in a crisis right now. We need certain things, including education and policing and sentencing guidelines to drive this terror from our midst. Because we're in a situation now where the community wakes up every morning and we don't know which synagogue is going to be hit, which school, who's going to suffer for it. But at the moment, it's something that's affecting all Australians, and not enough is being done about it.
Well, and Anthony Albanese hasn't embraced this idea of a national cabinet on this issue. But what pains me is this has all been so obvious for so long. As I mentioned at the top of the show, it was on October the 8th and 9th, 15 months ago, when we were saying there was too much weakness right at the outset in the response to the October the 7th atrocities. And that weakness has indeed increased the problem. At no stage has the government, federal or state, actually done anything.
It was painfully predictable, Chris. And when you saw, just as news of the atrocities was still breaking and people gathered on the streets of the electorate of Tony Burke, the Minister for Multiculturalism and Home Affairs, and praised those attacks and let off fireworks in jubilant celebration of those attacks, and it took weeks for that to be condemned. When you had on university encampments open praise for terrorism, people holding aloft the portraits of terrorist leaders, when you have cries for the destruction of the state of Israel and the annihilation of its Jewish population, and the education minister talks about those slogans and chants meaning different things to different people, it creates the leeway in which extremism thrives. It's not merely a matter for the federal government. We have to be fair, because university vice chancellors, community leaders, and when we're living in a time when influence is diffuse and social media influencers have enormous sway over public opinion, and they're either turning on the Jewish community or remaining silent and complicit, that's an enormous part of the problem as well.
It's as if the West has absolutely lost its mind, where people are so modern, are so sophisticated that they forgot how to call a spade a spade. They no longer are able to call a terrorist a terrorist. They say, no, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, and they've got a cause as well. It's that inability to be able to identify evil and to be able to call out hate and take action, which tragically could be the bane of the West. Now, this is a problem that is only within the West, but in the East, it's not a problem. Take a look at what former Islamic extremist Imam Mohammed Tawhidi, an Australian cleric, has to say about the huge mistake that the West is doing, what they don't understand, that which is so obvious in the East.
The other extremist groups, like the Muslim Brotherhood, who are friends with the IRGC and Hezbollah people, they cannot operate in Bahrain, in Oman. These are Muslim countries. Where do they operate? In London, in France, in Washington, D.C., in Australia, in Canada, Toronto. They operate here. They have bank accounts. They register charity. Right. So Macron, the president of France, recently said the Islamic world is in a crisis. I say, no, you are in a crisis. You went to the Muslim countries and you imported the garbage that the Muslim countries wanted to put in prison or isolate away from society. You went and you imported them. Why? For cheap labor. But these Islamist extremists, they don't want to work. They want free welfare. They want to marry French women, blonde hair, blue eyes. They don't have time to work. So look at Poland. They don't complain from Islamic extremism, not a single terrorist attack in Poland. The moment they sense there's a problem, they crack down on it. Polish policy, beautiful. The French, no, come. When they come, they use the resources. They go to Washington, D.C., and they sit in Congress. They support the Iranian regime. They go against the sanctions in Congress, right, with their hijab. Why? Because the ideology is filth to begin with. When you import that, or you allow it in, or you amplify it, or you glorify it in any way, you make your bed, sleep in it. So that is also a problem of the West. The question is, Tina, did the extremists become stronger or the West become weaker? I say it's both.
Turns out that the West is so modern that it's entirely lost its sense of direction. People that are so modern, they're so removed from the antiquated rules of the Bible, of religion. They're so obsessed with modernity and a mindset where everything goes and everything is permissible, everything is allowed, that they cannot tell the difference between right and wrong. If you were to sail out into the ocean with your yacht, there's no police over there. There's nobody who's going to tell you what to do, but you'll notice that any sailor worth his weight in salt will watch that compass in order to know where to navigate. When one such sailor was asked why it was that he was so obsessive over the compass, when nobody would know the difference anyways, he said these following words: in order to enjoy the freedom of the high seas, one must first make himself a slave to the compass. Because if you don't make yourself a slave to the compass, if you don't follow the rules, you're going to head straight on into a hurricane or some other natural phenomenon, and you're going to drown and die. It's only when you're able to follow the compass and you're able to really observe the rules that you're able to enjoy the freedom of the high seas. And the same goes with life as well. It's only when we're able to adhere to the rules of life, to monogamy, to monotheism, to goodness and kindness, and to calling out evil wherever it is found, and not justifying and allowing every terrorist to march in the streets of our capitals. It's only when we have the strength, the courage, and the humility to adhere to a system of rules, the most ancient rules in the world, the most timeless rules in the world, the rules of the Torah. It's only then that we are able to have our compass that will lead us away from disaster and towards an ability to enjoy the freedom that this beautiful world has to offer us.